Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, how do you build a gaming PC for less than $20? Well, unless you're willing to take some silly risks and don't mind sacrificing the non-essential components like a PC case, I don't think that's essential, is it? Then it's probably not going to be possible. Today's machine then is one that's running mainly thanks to luck and power of prayer. This machine started life as an unreliable, sometimes working Acer Aspire desktop that I won on eBay for a few pounds, not including postage. See, postage costs can sometimes be the real kicker when trying to save money, and here in the UK, local collection isn't always possible right now due to, well, I'm sure you probably know. So, this sometimes working, sometimes non-working system was in a pretty bad way when it arrived, but it actually did turn on after removing the old graphics card, which seemed to be the problem. Nonetheless, I decided to remove everything from the battered housing because not only did I want to dust off all of these aging components, but the cheap graphics card I found to replace the old one wouldn't fit inside this small form factor enclosure. The card in question then to replace our old broken one is a 2GB Asus GTX 650, which was also sold as untested and or broken. The word untested is usually a seller's way of saying it's broken, but we don't want to say it's broken in case no one buys it. If we list it as untested, we don't have to take responsibility when the seller takes what they think is a risk, only to find out it doesn't work. However, sometimes these cards are legitimately untested, and I'm not saying all sellers are trying to deceive you, because this one seemed to work fine. So if the lack of case isn't enough to put you off by now, then the power supply might be. I'm not comfortable in the slightest with pairing a discrete GPU with this old 220W OEM Acer PSU, but because my feelings of curiosity always outweigh fear and apprehension, I decided to take one for the team and hope that we wouldn't be seeing orange sparks and hearing loud bangs. Luckily, it fired up, and I even managed to save this little power button from the original case, so not only is this build cheap, but it has RGB. Well, it has B anyway, so yeah. It's pretty terrible and shouldn't work. That's how I plan to approach this video, to be honest. It was going to be an untested parts build video that I was expecting to be about 2 minutes long, but now that it is working or clinging to life by a very thin thread, we should probably test some games. Now, it goes without saying that this is better suited to older or less intensive titles, but you can still play some older AAA games here. Sometimes the i3-540 will be the bottleneck, and sometimes the GTX 650 will be the problem. It all depends on what game you're playing. So the first game we tested was CSGO at 1080p, here with the i3-540 and the GTX 650, along with the standard 8GB of RAM that came with the system. All of these games are also running off the 1TB Western Digital green drive that came with the PC as well. So CSGO is more CPU reliant, but even with the i3 here, it runs fairly well. You're going to see a few frames above 60 FPS, and then you're going to see a few figures that dip below that. Sometimes the frame rate will shoot over 100 FPS. I didn't do an exact frame rate recording here because I had some trouble with the game starting. I didn't think I'd be able to include this in the benchmark, but after reinstalling the GTX 650 drivers, things seem to be working fine. I thought for a minute the card broke, but no, it's still working fine. It's still working fine at the time of this recording. And yeah, CSGO is going to be somewhat playable, but there will still be a few dips. But we'll move on to some games now where I have the exact benchmarking figures for you. And we're going to start off then with The Elder Scrolls Skyrim. This is the original 2011 game, not the remade or remastered version that came out in, 2016. This first version of the game does run a lot better, and of course you can play it with older cards that don't always support DirectX 11. This GTX 650, however, does and will launch all of the newest games, even if it can't run them that smoothly. The exception is actually Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which won't work on the 700 series cards or below. Anyway, in Skyrim 1080p once again, we were seeing 63 frames per second with fairly respectable 1 and 0.1% lows to go with it. I chose 1080p medium here and not 720p low because although we were hitting our monitor's refresh rate limit of about 75 FPS, at the lowest settings, I thought that we might as well push Skyrim as far as we could on this system, and I'm pleased to say that we were still hitting 60 FPS a lot of the time. So another Bethesda game now, this is Fallout 4, obviously a bit newer than Skyrim. I think it runs on the same engine, it's just been improved and tweaked since first time round, but 47 FPS here at 720p low, playing on 1080p did mean that we still saw 30 FPS in some places, but the experience overall was far too juddery, and so we resorted back to 720p with the low settings, but we did have FXAA on just to avoid some of those horrible looking jagged lines. Next up we have Fortnite. Now this has a new performance mode which we could have enabled. All this does basically is make the graphics even worse, but it does give you more performance. Here though we stuck to 80% of 1080p resolution and we saw an average of 54. Now actually I'd probably recommend 900p or lower with the performance mode enabled. The more frames you can get from Fortnite the better. 54 FPS was the average, and as you can tell by the 1.1% lows here, there was certainly a few issues with stutter. This is mainly due to the i3 540 on this occasion though, and you may experience some graphical glitches with 2 core processors as well, even if they do have 4 threads. The same can be said for GTA 5. Now the game is going to be more problematic on CPUs that don't have hyper-threading, but with the hyper-threading here it certainly helps out a little bit. We were running at 1080p once again with the normal settings, so everything basically on low here, and 49 FPS was the average, with 1.1% lows of 31 and 24 respectively, so not bad in terms of stutter, but there is certainly room for improvement. GTA 5 always seems to run quite well though these days, even on lower end hardware, but it is an aging game after all. To finalise then, I tried Red Dead Redemption 2. I kept the FXAA on here and reduced everything else to low with 720p native resolution. We didn't drop that using the resolution scaling or anything. This was full fat 720p. 22 FPS was the average, and the 1.1% lows meant that the game was pretty unplayable with this hardware. But I think that's more the fault of the graphics card here. The i3 540 managed to hold up quite well, and in fact I've tested one of these first gen i3s before and they've run this game absolutely fine, providing you don't mind closer to 30 FPS. But there we go, this cheap, disastrous PC video originally was going to be a lot more disastrous than this, but I hope you've enjoyed it nonetheless. I wasn't expecting to actually put this thing together and then have it work, so yeah, this video surprised me as well. But there we go. If you enjoyed this cheap system video, then leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.